Alright, so today we're going to be talking about server-side programming, which is interesting because this class is all about front-end development. And server-side programming is also known as back-end development. So right here I've got a few different things that show the differences between server-side and client-side. Server-side, guess where it's processed? On the server. And this is also known as the back-end, so it takes care of a few different things. First is accessing databases, which we'll talk about a little bit later. It controls business rules. So this would be things, most software development teams will have someone in charge of business and implementing the business rules. So these would be things like for example, if a company only ships things to the western United States or the eastern United States or only to Mexico or only to Canada, then the business rules would be in charge of that. Another example is discounts for premium customers. And then the last thing we have here is validation, which can be done on the front end, like we've done before with the email tag in our form. That way it requires an @ and a valid email address. But validation on the server is much more important for security reasons. And we'll get a little bit more into that later. The client side, the client itself is the web browser. It creates the user interface, styling, animation, all the stuff that we've worked on this semester, and it processes user input, which we've done with the forms. And then the last thing is it deals with local storage and cookies, which we haven't covered, but that's what the client side will do. Now here's a list of different things we have, or different web technologies that are used for the server side and the client side. So the server side we have PHP, Python, SQL, or it's also called SQL, which takes care of databases, and then C#, C++, Visual Basic, Java, JSP, ASP, Perl, Ruby on Rails, and a whole lot more. There are a lot of different web technologies and languages that can be used on servers to process different data. And on the client side, there's fewer. So we've got JavaScript, which we've worked with, HTML, CSS, Ajax as well, and Flash, which is no longer really used. It's being phased out, and it's rare to find Flash in any modern websites. So here's a very simplified view of how data is reached on the internet. So starting from the bottom, we have the clients, so browsers that are accessed on tablets, phones, desktops, laptops, and they access websites that are held on servers. So we've worked with HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and you can all see that through, for example, the Chrome Inspector. So when you're viewing the website, press F12, and you can see all the code that's there. Now there is the code that's held on the server, and if you want to access the database behind it, the server is the part that calls the database. You should not be able to directly call the database from the client, because that would be a huge breach in security. And knowing that, we can go forward to the next section. Here's an example of a database. You can think of a database kind of like an Excel spreadsheet. So you can see at the top of it, there's a row that has name, phone number, age, student ID, GPA. So this would be a database, an example of showing a student directory. So under the names, you've got a few different examples: phone number, age, student ID, GPA. The database holds all this information, and it's the server's responsibility to be able to call that information. Now here on our next screen, we have an example of creating that table. So this is SQL or SQL, and one of the best things about SQL is how readable it is. It's got really good human readability. So you see at the very top it says create table, and then you give it the name, which is students, and it's enclosed in parentheses. And then you have each row has two different words. So the first one will be the name of the column. So the first one is name. Second one is varchar, which is a string with a specified maximum length. So we're not going to let people have names in our database that are more than 255 characters. That would be an extremely long name. The phone with an attribute of int, because your phone number is going to be all numbers, all whole numbers. So it doesn't allow any decimal points. You can't have your phone number be 2.6. It's all going to be 801, whatever. And age will be an int as well, and student ID will be an int. And the student ID one is an important aspect. Each table needs to have a primary key. So this means if you need to identify the student, this attribute will be unique to any other attribute. Because there's a lot of other people, I mean, if you want to find someone named John Smith at BYU Idaho, there's probably more than one of them. So you're not going to be able to correctly identify the students simply by their name. But the student ID will be something unique. So if you need to look up a student, that's how you'll be able to find them. And then the GPA, since this will be a decimal number, there'll be two different numbers on that. The first one, the 3, stands for how many digits is allowed in it. So there will be 3 digits. And then 1 will be the number of digits before the decimal point. Because the GPA will be something like 3.54, 3.78. So 1 number, decimal, then 2 numbers. Even if it rounds off, it'll still be 3.00. Here's an example why server-side validation is so incredibly important. Here's a great comic from XKCD. Mother calls the school, or the school calls the mother. Hi, this is your son's school. We're having some computer trouble. Oh no, did he break something? In a way. Did you really name your son Robert Drop Table Students? Oh yeah, little Bubby Tables we call him. Well, we've lost the student's records. I hope you're happy. And I hope you've learned to sanitize your database inputs. So this was an example where they did not sanitize their inputs, or in other words, they didn't validate them correctly so that anyone could put in any sort of code that they want. This is an issue because if it allows for someone to just put drop table and then it deletes all the students' information, of course that causes some very serious issues. You can see a lot of times if you go to put in some specific code like that, it will treat that code just as normal text. So for example, if you go into, WordPress.com is a good example. Imagine if if you were writing a blog, which is basically all created in a PE element. If that allowed for code to be put in, that could cause some issues. But if you were to write in there and put bracket h1, then it just treats that as a text. So it basically uses an escape character to avoid that. Now, there's different ways of doing this. Some that are a lot more complex. But the validation is really important so that none of this can happen. And that is about it. Thanks for everyone watching, and let me know what you thought, how this could have improved. I feel very uncomfortable talking to a microphone like this, and I'm really excited for next semester when I'm going to be taking the backend development class. Thanks.